Welcome back, Cinemaniacs, to another episode of Den of Sin with Devin and James. I am one of your co-hosts, James. The other co-host, obviously, being Devin. Hey, Devin, how you doing today?
I'm okay. How you doing, James?
Doing okay. Just coming back from going was on a mini vacation. I guess it was a legitimate vacation. It was over a week's vacation, so I guess that's a legitimate vacation. I didn't go anywhere too crazy. Went to the beach, basically, or as close to tech beaches that Texas can offer. No, it was nice. It was Galveston Island. It was very nice. But yeah, I just started back up at work. So, dealing with the work stress, the introduction of work stress back into my life. Outside of that, just watching some movies, man. How you doing?
I've been okay. I mean, the world is still slightly upside down, although things seem to be balancing a little bit better. I've been watching a lot of movies because of this topic, actually. We had decided that we were going to take 1989 as this episode's topic, the films of 1989.
Correct.
No real reason, but similarly, like the other years that we've selected, for whatever reason, that year had seemed to rise to both of our minds individually. And we figured there must be creepy. Something here. Yeah. We should co-host a show or
that's
something.
Happened. Yeah, I know. But it goes to a weird coincidence link. Like we're on the same brain waves, we're sharing of one mind. But yeah, both of us instinctively both chose randomly 19. I mean, again, there's how many years are there, Devin? There's a lot of years. Over 2,000. I even hear.
I've heard they've even got years before that.
I heard that too. I heard a rumor. I don't know what BC means, but I haven't figured that out. But
they weren't making movies then, so I just don't give a shit.
Exactly. I agree. Yeah.
I care about the movie.
But yeah, so it's just weird that we chose the same year both randomly. But again, I think it speaks to how simpatico we are. So it's a good thing.
Agreed. We did run into I wouldn't call it a snag, maybe a potential snag that we averted in dealing with 1989 and just looking over the list of 1989 films. This was a huge year. Arguably, this is the year that the blockbuster became a way of life, whereas, Jaws is commonly referred to as the start of the blockbuster. But it seemed like through most of our childhoods, there was maybe one or sometimes two major event movies that summer, and occasionally there might be an extra one at Christmas time or something. 1989 was when the summer became known for the summer blockbuster, and there was one coming out just about every week. And as we started to break it down and try to figure out the lists of what we want to watch or rewatch or ignore completely, because there's a couple of those in 1989 as well, we decided we were going to break it down into 3 episodes, as you and I have a tendency to enjoy speaking. This is going to be our first planned multi-parter. It's actually going to be our first 3-parter rather than just deciding to do an extra part at the end when we run out of time. But we're giving it a little bit of order. In this first one, we're going to be doing horror and science fiction of 1989, which I think is the topic that you and I were both most chomping at the bit to get to. And then the next episode, we'll go ahead and do 1989's action and thrillers. And then we'll follow that up with the comedies and dramas of 1989, because there's just as many comedies, I feel, as there were horror movies, or almost anyways. Dramas are going to be interesting. I think it's going to be mostly a comedy episode. And I think just to make sure that we are able to cover as much as we can possibly cover, there were a number of horror and comedy hybrids and sci-fi comedy hybrids that came out in 1989. And there's a real thin line between what's a horror comedy versus what's a comedy horror. And we might get into that a little bit today. But ultimately, I just wanted to tell people before you start getting upset that we're leaving anything like Ghostbusters 2 off of our list here, we're going to get to that when we get to the comedy stuff. I want to keep it primarily horror based, and then maybe some horror that strays into comedy more than the reverse. But do you know what 1989 also has the distinction of being in the horror world, James?
I think I do. I mean, there's a couple of things it achieved that I could talk about, but I think you might be referring to the fact that they're the 3 big horror franchises of its era all had a film released in the same year.
Exactly. This was, and there were other big ones of the era too that had sequels this year as well. But let's face it, when we're talking about slasher sequels or even horror sequels in general, we're generally talking about Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Friday the 13th. And only twice in all of the history of those long franchises have all three been appearing on American cinema screens the same year. The other year actually was 1988. So these 2 years are the only years that this happened. I could probably guess at what your favorite is amongst those three, but we had, let's see, to put a specific spin on it, there was Friday the 13th, Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, Halloween 5, The Revenge of Michael Myers, and A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child. Do you have a favorite of those?
I do. So I have a very complicated relationship with almost all of those films. I can tell you first off, my least favorite is definitely Dream Child.
Really?
It's my least favorite of all of them. It's probably my least favorite of the entire Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. I don't know your feelings on the matter, but I feel like it's, first off, that kid is so annoying. But
the Dream Child
well, I'll
himself.
tell you, so that kid is such a weird little actor. But I will say that, so I've got on record as saying that I'm not a huge fan of the Michael Myers Halloween sequels.
Yeah, that's why I was surprised.
I love the first Halloween. Yeah, I'm not a fan. So that's my least. I mean, well, let me get into this. So my favorite of those is probably somebody say the least favorite of horror, diehard horror fans. My favorite of those three of that year is Jason Takes Manhattan. I think it's the most fun. It's a flawed movie to say the least, but I think it's one of the most memorable, most fun. And in fact, I still think it's probably the funnest Jason we've ever had on screen, and a lot of it is due to Kane Hodder's performance. But it's just such a fun movie. It's so stupid, and again, it gets a lot wrong. There's a lot of stupid decisions that the filmmakers made,
like geography,
but it's still super fun. I mean, yeah, that's one of them. The whole thing with him like transforming back to a little baby boy, but he's not the mutant Jason that we've seen. He's like a normal little kid, and there's a lot of weird. The whole ending is so bizarre. Even though I love the fact that he's basically killed by toxic waste, him reverting back to being like a little bull. Like, there's just a lot of weirdness with Jason Takes Manhattan. We could do a whole episode just on that movie. But it does have my favorite sequence in the entire franchise is when Jason's on the roof in the little boxing match. Just such a great sequence with such a great ending. But so let me real quickly, I'm sorry as I ramble on about this, but I will say I do like Halloween 5. I think Halloween 5 is actually my favorite Michael Myers films outside of the first one. It's slow. I know a lot of people do not like the whole story arc with the little girl and where that goes, but I do. And I actually think there's a vibe to the fifth installment of Halloween that really echoes and mirrors the vibe of the first film, as far as just like, for me personally, it feels like Halloween, where I feel like the majority of Halloween sequels do not have that same sort of. Halloween 1, Halloween 3 are my favorites. Every other film of that is less than my favorite, I'll say, to be nice. But I do think the Return of Michael Myers, I think, is the most successful in capturing what I liked about the first movie.
The Return, or do you mean?
But again,
Revenge?
It's very slow. Revenge, excuse me. I do that constantly. Part 5, The Revenge of Michael Myers, is I think the one I like the most. What about you, Devin?
My order is actually probably completely, well, I wouldn't say opposite of yours. I expected you to pick Friday the 13th as your favorite because you are a Jason guy.
It is.
And I'm a Jason guy too. Come on, it's silly shit like Marvel versus DC as to whose fans are better and whatever. I love all these masked killers, but Friday the 13th, Jason Takes Manhattan is probably the second one in my favorite list of this year. Halloween 5 was what surprised me from you, because Halloween 5 was my least favorite. Because I did find it really boring, like you said. I do like the storyline with Danielle Harris as the little girl who turns out to have a psychic connection to Michael Myers, but also a familial one.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting, and I would have been fine if they had continued on into that storyline for part 6. What I don't like about part 5 introducing is the damn man in black who comes in and breaks Michael Myers out of prison at the end of the movie. The guys who wrote that have literally said that they didn't know what the storyline behind that was. They just knew there was going to be a sequel because there's always a sequel. And they thought for once, instead of killing off the bad guy, they would actually start the lead in to the next one with the end of,
At the end
part
of it.
5. Yes. So they actually had no plans at all as to what the Man in Black was or what he was going to represent. And by the time we actually got the answer, which would be several years later after this being something of a flop in 1989, you finally get the answer to who the Man in Black was, and it leads into the whole druid thing, which was just awful. My favorite of the year was Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5, which I am a Freddy guy. I love Freddy Krueger. To me, was as much a part of my childhood as Mickey Mouse. Even though I wasn't seeing a lot of the movies when I was super young, I was always hyper aware of who Freddy Krueger was, advertisements in the TV guide and at the video store, of course. And back then, Fox used to play them occasionally, and I would see the edited versions. And then once I got to, well, I guess by about 89, I was starting to sneak them late on Cinemax when everyone thought I was asleep. So I had started to see the full uncut versions of these. And 5 was one of the first ones that I saw uncut, but also it was the first one I ever owned. I got a previously viewed copy of it at my video store back when that was a thing. And I treasured that thing. But as a result, even though Part 5 wasn't even my favorite Elm Street back then, it was by that fact the one that I watched the most often. So I have some really fond memories tied to that. One of them actually includes you involving Super Freddy.
That's that's one of the most. That's literally one of the most memorable things. It's probably my favorite thing about the whole movie. But
just to give the briefest version of that story, just imagine 3 nerds, James, myself, and Casey, our guest from the John Carpenter episode, sitting in a Fat Burger. We were all 19, 20 years old, and just shouting "Super Freddy Sucker" at the top of our. Okay. I'm Super Freddy Sucker.
That was a good night. So, I mean, there are things about Dream Child that I like as far as specific sequences and stuff, but I feel like the first 3 Nightmare on Elm Street movies are so good, and that, for the longest time I was such a defender of Freddy's Revenge Part 2 but everybody else seemed to hate Part 2, and I still think Part 2 might even it might be my all-time favorite, even more than the Dream Warriors, which is usually my go-to favorite. But it's just there's just so many layers that I've always enjoyed. I still think it's the scariest Freddy we've ever seen, even more scary than the first film. But the first 3 are so great, and then the fourth one is good. And I know some people still think the fourth one is their favorite or the best in the series. But I would say the first 3 are so great, and the fourth one is still so strong that by the fifth one, I mean, Freddy at that point is basically fucking Bugs Bunny, and there's a lot of things which
he's Bugs Bunny with a pizza face.
That's right, exactly. Here's the thing is, though, 1999 is a great year for horror, as we'll get into, to the point that some of these big franchises, which were obviously probably the bigger horror films of the year, don't even come in my top 10 favorite horror films of that year, even though there's some part of the bigger franchises. So it's just that year is such a great year for horror that the fact that we even got 3, we got one of each of those franchises is incredible. I mean, it was an incredible year for horror. But yeah, I would say of those ones, the one I watched the most is Jason Takes Manhattan. And again, that's sort of sacrilegious amongst a lot of horror fans because a lot of people hate that fucking movie. I think the 3 of 89 are probably some of the most universally hated amongst all the fans of those films. So maybe not the best year for those film franchises specifically, even though, again, I don't even think, for me personally, I don't think any of them are necessarily the worst of their franchises, for me personally. So.
Yeah, but none of them are the best either. And
no, hands down, yeah.
They're mediocre at best, generally speaking. I have a love for all 3 of them. But I will say this for Elm Street as an argument, as series overall. When you come upon entries in the series, which, let's face it, their biggest flaw out of all 3 of these movies is probably that all 3 are a little bit boring because their storylines don't go anywhere and we're just waiting to get to the kill scenes. Yeah. But Freddy always had the more interesting or more creative kill scenes. Granted, Jason had that great boxing match on top of a building in this one, which is one of the most memorable slasher murder scenes in all of slasher history. But overall, I mean, looking at the deaths in Elm Street 5, you've got the inexplicable guy turning into a machine, which makes no sense. And you're not even entirely sure whether the guy's asleep when it's happening. But it's frightening.
That sequence is absolutely terrifying. Yes, it's true. And I think the effects work is great. And I actually think it's weird that it's very reminiscent of another horror movie, a seminal horror film that came out in the same year. There's a lot of parallels visually between that sequence and another film that we'll probably bring up later.
I think I know which one you're talking
it was
about
fun. It was just something that I didn't realize until doing this list that they were both released in the same year, because it was something that I just always thought the other film that I'm talking about, which we'll bring up at some point, must have been before this, because I always thought it was sort of maybe an homage, but again, it might be just one of those things where it's just a weird coincidence. But yeah, and again, I think, I don't know what the budgets were for those three films specifically, but it definitely felt like, especially with the effects in Dream Child, that one had the most effects budget. There was a lot of even more than in the previous films, a lot more digital effects in that film specifically. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting that all three of those came out. But man, talk about a year for a horror movie. It is still going into it. One of the reasons I chose, I think like I said, that I sort of had this year in mind was because of just that weird position between going from an 80s movie into 90s movies, and 80s movies and 90s movies are very distinctly different in vibe, and that weird position that a lot of these films hold is sort of almost like transition. Like, are they an 80s movie? Is it an early 90s movie? Like the vibe is kind of in between those. But I almost feel like this is even a topic that the horror movies 1989 would be something I feel like we could just do just one specific podcast series about. Because I feel like there's so many of these movies that deserve more in-depth look than probably we're going to be able to afford to give it tonight. There are movies on this list from this year that I feel like are some of my favorite horror movies of all time. But is there any movie that you are super excited to talk about, or any aspect of these films that you're super excited to talk about?
There's a ton of them that I want to get into. There was a lot of great American ones. There's a lot of great foreign films that came out this year too. While we're here in Sequel Corner, there is one list that I want to read off, and I swear this is my only list for this episode. But this list is so extensive, I think other people might be impressed with it, because, like I said, several other slasher movies had sequels in 1989, but it wasn't just the slasher movies. I'm going to read off a list of the sequels that are only in the horror sci-fi genres, and I am going to include some of the horror comedies as well that I said we'll get back to again in another episode. But just to give the full breadth of again, these are only horror sci-fi or horror sci-fi adjacent movies of 1989. You've got Amityville 4, The Evil Escapes, Back to the Future Part 2, Beyond the Door 3, Chud 2, Bud the Chud, Curse 2, The Bite, The Fly 2, Gnaw, Food of the Gods 2, Friday the 13th, Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, Ghostbusters 2, Godzilla vs. Biollante, Halloween 5, The Revenge of Michael Myers, Howling 5, The Rebirth. That's the difference between Halloween and Howling, like the werewolf movies. Howling 5, The Rebirth, A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child, Prom Night 3, The Last Kiss, The Return of Swamp Thing, Silent Night, Deadly Night 3, Better Watch Out, Sleepaway Camp 3, Teenage Wasteland, Star Trek 5, The Final Frontier, Stepfather 2, The Toxic Avenger Part 2, and The Toxic Avenger Part 3, The Last Temptation of Toxie, which were shot together, Zombie 4, After Death, plus you have the first non-sequel installments of the Bill and Ted series, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, Psycho Cop, Puppet Master, the Warlock series, plus two versions of Phantom of the Opera, one with Robert Englund and one called Phantom of the Mall, Eric's Revenge, co-starring Pauly Shore. Plus, The Church was supposed to be Demons 3, but a movie called The Ogre was marketed as Demons 3 in other territories. Plus, the movie Shocker was created to be a series by Wes Craven. Plus, The Horror Show, another serial killer from an electric chair, was also intended to be a series. Neither of those made it to series. And side note, Horror Show was actually marketed as House 3, the horror show internationally. And that's without even getting into all the other stuff. I mean, there's a Batman, an Indiana Jones, a James Bond, a Karate Kid, a Lethal Weapon, and even a Police Academy in 1989.
That's right. God, there's so much. I mean, first off, I'm glad you brought up one of my weirdly favorite subgenres, the serial killer gets electrocuted or murdered and comes back to life as a there's The Destroyer, there's Horror Show. A few years later, there's the Sixth Power.
I think there's only a year later.
Is it 91 or 90? I thought maybe it's 90. Maybe it's a year later.
It's 90, the one with Lou Diamond Phillips.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Yes.
But yeah, it's a weirdly if one of my favorite subgenres.
I personally think that the horror show would have been a bigger hit if it had had the title Shocker, and then we could just get rid. I mean, I shouldn't say get rid of Shocker. I'm a big Wes Craven fan, and there's nothing wrong with Shocker really, but and the horror show is not the greatest movie in the world either.
But it has the pride of Redlands, California, Brian James as the killer.
Brian James.
But I actually love them all. I do love the Shocker. The weird thing is that, like, you know, the Shocker is very, like, on point. It's a guy it's a murderer in the throw who is electrocuted and comes back as electricity. He's an electric-based killer.
Yes.
Horror show is about a dude who's electrocuted and then lives in a furnace. Doesn't make a lot of sense. Doesn't really make a lick of sense. But it's you know, those are films I do enjoy. It is weird though, like you said, it was marketed as House 3 in Europe specifically. I don't know if it was fully international. I do know Europe specifically was marketed as House 3, and in fact, it's included in a lot of sets as, you know, in like House, you know, the House film series, like film sets you can buy it as part of like the House series.
Yes, it's part of the box set, and it confused me as a kid because I never put House together with horror show, but I remember being at the video store in the early 90s and seeing the box for House 4 and being like, wait a minute, I'm missing a house somewhere.
Where's 3? That's it. The exact same story. I didn't realize until a few years ago, that whole thing, because House 4, The Repossession, which is one of the greatest, dumbest, but greatest sequel titles of all time, The Repossession, just works so perfectly. Again, I was a kid, I was like, wait, where's 3? I had the exact same story. So as a kid, I was upset because I felt like I was cheated. You know, you mentioned a film. I'm just going to kick this off because one of the films I'm most excited to talk about, just because it's a film I love, is The Church. Michael Soave directed, who's an apprentice to Dario Argento, and was actually, you know, he's you know, served I think as a second AD, if I'm not mistaken. Was an actor. He's the guy that in the movie Demons, he gives the young girls the tickets for the movie in that weird half mask. But I think Church is one of the most underappreciated. I really put it at the top of my most underappreciated horror films ever. I think it's one of the truly most genuinely creepy horror movies. I think the whole like the third act is fucking awesome and creepy. And I do have a weird love and or fascination with horror movies that sort of lock their, you know, all the protagonists like in a location and they can't escape. There's something very creepy about that. I think a lot of my nightmares as a kid sort of had that same concept. You can't get out of a place, but you know, I love the characters. I love the script. It does, for some people, maybe the first act moves a little slow, or at least the first act and the second act maybe moves a little slow. I can even sort of see that complaint myself, but for me, I think the movie is fantastic. I love pretty much everything about it, and I feel like it's one of those movies that sort of, you know, it's a late 80s movie, but it definitely has its roots in the early 80s and even like the late 70s, you know, Italian horror movie. Like there's a lot of things that's drawing inspiration from that, like 15 years earlier than it, but it sort of ends the 80s, I think, perfectly for Italian horror. But and again, I think Michael Soave, who's done other things I'm a big fan of, I think is massively underappreciated. But yeah, I feel like I don't know if you have any relationship with that movie at all, but it's always it's one of the films I'm always most excited to talk about when it comes up.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I rented it when I was about 12, 13, something like that. The right age to find it at the video store, and I didn't really. I was maybe even just a couple of weeks away from really discovering Italian horror films. Like a lot of people, my entrance was Fulci's Zombie. So I didn't recognize it for what it was at the time. I just remember really enjoying it and thinking it was weird. I mean, you can tell that the voices are dubbed, which is kind of a cornerstone of Italian horror. Italian cinema in general. I've actually been studying giallo films a lot lately for a upcoming project of mine, and you can lump in giallo and straight up horror and the spaghetti westerns and all these movies. They shoot it using an international cast. There's usually one or two Americans in there, kind of the Clint Eastwoods, if you will, of the world, or John Saxon much more often.
Exactly. Thankfully.
Yes, this is a good thing. And then the rest of the cast is usually a lot of Italian and Spanish actors because the financing comes from both places, and they frequently shot Italian movies in Spain. And there's usually a couple of Germans snuck in there too for a lot of them.
I was going to say a lot of Germans, and which also a lot of the Italian production team, whether directors, writers, or even actors who have authentic Italian names, would change their names inexplicably a lot of time to very either Germanic sounding names or Eastern European sounding names for whatever weird reason.
Yeah.
Maybe to help, I don't know, but weirdly though, a lot of German actors. But that's, and the production of those films are always really interesting because you hear like a lot of times the actors were speaking two separate languages, like they couldn't even understand each other.
You might have the American actors speaking in English, and then the Spanish nun or something speaking in Spanish, and then it's all dubbed in English anyways because the script is in English, even though it's an Italian film and a Spanish production, and so then even the Americans are overdubbed. Now that never ended up happening to Clint Eastwood, but it's happened to a lot of other actors, and it happened to everybody in the church. Everybody was overdubbed. But the creep factor, the creepiness of Italian horror, it builds, and that's that slowness that you talked about in the beginning. It's the church itself is not. It doesn't start slow. It has a sort of prologue.
Well, the opening sequence is fucking great. Yeah.
Yeah. It has a prologue that gets you right into it. And that might be why some people think it's slow, because then it goes into the story after it set you off with a pretty disturbing prologue. And then it takes a little while for it to start to get a little weird once you get into the actual church that's been built around this, the site of this atrocity that occurred in, what was it? Was it in the 19th century or medieval times? I don't know when.
I think it was like 17th. I mean, yeah, it was like it was medieval times basically.
Yes, this church. It was a rogue group of badass Catholics during the Crusades. So there we go. It was during the Crusades.
Holy Knights.
Yes, who just obliterate this town and cover it up with the big cross and build a church around it to keep the souls of the dead from coming back to exact their revenge. And of course, now it's the 80s and somebody's going to come along and upset the order of things.
Fuck it up.
Yeah, you end up with demonic, vengeful spirits coming out and basically sealing everybody in the church. And they, all the regulars are there. There's a bride and groom and a group of children on a field trip and all the groups that anybody would want to get out of a point of danger. And for the most part, I don't want to give anything away, but it definitely ends in a way that if you're familiar with Italian films, you can see it coming.
100%. The thing is, the Italians never shied away from like sacrilegious imagery or very like religious-based horror. They're, Italy, Roman Catholicism, they're very intrinsically connected. But I like that, and I think that
they're viscerally connected anyways. They're that religion, more than most forms of Christianity anyways, tend to have a lot more of the statues and symbols of their faith, and it's a very visceral thing. A lot of obviously we know a lot of paintings. The Last Supper is painted by a Catholic. It's no surprise.
And there's a lot of bloodshed in the history of the church and stuff too. So but the thing is, what I like about the church anyways is that it deals with all these like kind of like very dark themes, but it's still got a lot of like over the top horror sequences and a lot of crazy gore. I think the last 15 minutes are fucking one of my again, that's what I think, but there's a lot of like crazy imagery that's happening and stuff. But it's a film I love. And I think for me, if people ever ask like, what do you give me a list of your favorite like top 5 most underappreciated horror films, it's literally always in my top 5. So
yeah, it feels to me like it earned its way there. There was another low budget movie, an American movie this time, that came out in 1989 that actually made me think of the church as I was watching it. And I was watching it based on your suggestion, actually, because I had never heard of this before. It's called Nightwish. And my feeling watching Nightwish, it's not brilliant or anything. I don't know how you felt about it. Did you get a chance to watch it or?
No, in fact, we talked about it and about how there's a few movies I thought there was only a handful of movies I hadn't seen in this year. Then again, diving more, there was even more movies I realized some of them I hadn't even heard of, Nightwish being one of them that I hadn't even heard of until this. We decided to do this episode. I didn't even see, was it available for streaming?
I want to say I found it on Tubi. I found almost everything on Tubi, by the way.
Fucking Tubi.
It's my new favorite streaming service just based on this episode alone, because they have got so much crazy 1989 horror on Tubi right now, and it's a free service, ads based, but it is a free service. So any of these titles, if you're interested, I found most of them on Tubi, Amazon Prime, and I found a few on Arrow and a few on Shudder. but for the most part on Tubi, including some of the weirder ones. And
Yeah.
Nightwish, I won't get too far into it because I just
the premise doesn't
well,
the premise doesn't exactly like elicit a very strong reaction. That's the simple premise, but
no, but I will say this because this is what I was interested in talking to you about it for. Was my feeling on it was that if it had been an Italian horror movie, it would be known more. It would have had more of a following. Probably would have had a little bit more gore too, which probably would have made a better impression. But the storyline of it, which is like a kind of a mad scientist who's he's a parapsychologist or paranormalist or something, and he's got his ragtag group of college interns, because all mad scientists had interns in the 80s.
That's right.
It takes them to this haunted house with the idea that they're going to bring a killer back to life, sort of thing. And my feeling the whole time I'm watching it is this is pretty bad, but if it had been Italian, I might have liked it. Like if it had the over the top sort of the dubbing of the dialogue and things like that, it would have stood out more to me.
Does this have Brian? Has Brian Thompson in it?
Yes. Maybe I think that's why I thought you had seen it, because he's not a huge role, but he's definitely there,
yeah. In fact,
and he's definitely memorable.
Yeah. I think maybe I have seen it. I realize it's again. There's another movie even that came out in 1999 that also has the Night something in it as well. I think I saw upon further investigation. Night.
You know what? Moonstalker was the other one that you mentioned in that same conversation you and I.
Moonstalker, I also haven't seen.
That was fun. That was a Moonstalker. Looked like it was made for about $5, and for that, I give it 5 stars. Like the fact that this movie was even made. Moonstalker, which I did find streaming online. I think only 1 or 2 of these I actually had to like pay money to rent, and a couple of them I just missed out on entirely because they were disc only, and I wasn't going to spend the $20. But yeah, Moonstalker was just a good fun time, and if you're a fan of slasher movies, you're going to get a kick out of it. If you don't like slasher movies, there's really no reason to visit it. But it is impressive just because you can tell it costs $5, but they stretched that $5 as far as they were going to. It almost felt like I was watching the regional theater troupe of Reno, Nevada in a slasher movie set in the snow, which people have been wanting to see Jason in the snow. So this was a rare slasher movie in the snow.
There you go. Since you brought that one up, I do feel like I have to talk about maybe the lowest budgeted film that came out that year that will probably even show up on these lists, and that is The Dead Next Door. Jared Bookwalter's, I would say, probably his most well-known film, probably his most rented. Jared Bookwalter's sort of a very weird. He was sort of a one-man production company, like of really, really bad, low-budget horror films, but it was all done in-house. Like he was the executive producer, writer, director, in a lot of the movies. Not a lot of great movies, although I do think. So the 2 films of his that most people will know if you're, a fan of 80s direct-to-video films would be Robot Ninja, which I've talked about in this podcast, I believe already, which, I'm a fan of. But the second one would be Dead Next Door. And I actually do think Dead Next Door is more redeemable than the rest of his films. I think, first off, I think a lot of the zombie. So it's basically the premise is if there's a zombie outbreak and 5 years later, there's basically the world is sort of just adapted to there being zombies, but there's also now a fucking religious cult that's pro-zombie that is such a weird plot device, but he used to sort of go along with it. First off, I think it's funny, both intentionally funny and then also maybe unintentionally funny, but it to me feels like his most competent film. He's not he's no Spielberg, but I feel like he definitely had a passion for the films. And the thing is too, he was working with micro budget films with like non-actors. And I think that's the thing. A lot of people give his movie shit, but he's basically hiring his friends and his like people from Akron, Ohio, people that he knows to basically star in these films. Really rarely ever worked with competent actors. And he still somehow manages to make like a film that you will actually watch all 90 minutes of and sort of say, well, that was a film I want.
Exactly.
The most, but I do think it's there's a charm to The Dead Next Door. I actually remember it was a film I'd rented because I thought the box art was so genuinely creepy. There's one zombie specifically that has this weird mesh mouth guard thing gated, like this is super creepy. But I actually really I think all of the zombies, especially there's a few key zombie designs in it that I think are actually really fun and kind of like on par with something like Return of the Living Dead Part 2, where like they're kind of cartoony zombies, but like still gory and I think are cool. I don't know. I have a weird soft spot for this movie, even though it's definitely not a good movie. But I think like the whole opening scene, there's a sequence in the beginning where, right at the very beginning, when they're sort of setting up the zombie attack, where like they're like in a video rental store called Pick a Flick, and you know it's like it's a video store in the 80s, and you see this like person going around picking out like Dawn of the Dead and all these zombie movies, and then puts them down on the counter, and it turns out to be a zombie. It's like, but and then the whole, like everybody in the video rental store freaks out and stuff. But it's I don't know, it's stupid. I mean, all the main characters' names are referenced. There's like a Savini, a Romero, like everybody's name in it is a reference to. I mean, it's very heavy-handed. But
there's a Commander Carpenter.
But again, I think Jared Bookwell. Carpenter. There's a Carpenter. There's a King. But yeah, it's a goofy ass movie, but weirdly one that I do have a weird soft spot for. It doesn't hold the same place as like Robot Ninja for me, but compared to, and you have to say, I haven't seen Zombie Cop, and I've heard Zombie Cop is actually a pretty cool movie, but the rest of his films not so great. At least not the ones I've seen. But the Dead Next Door is pretty fun.
Oh, what can you say about Well, it's not his best work. I mean, it's no Zombie Cop, but
exactly.
I love this. I'm actually really glad you brought this one up. Actually, I'm glad you brought it up right on the heels of Moonstalker too, because it is another one that obviously costs $5, and this one actually seems like it would be envious of the budget of Moonstalker. It was all shot on Super 8, and like you said, it was all the characters were named after horror movie personalities and really cheaply put together. Took 4 years to make, and I'm sure a lot of the people out there listening can relate to, like, when I was growing up, I made a lot of low budget movies on the weekends, high school, junior high era, that would get, like, honestly, from the first stuff we were making in 7th grade till the later stuff that I was making with my friend Greg in like junior year of high school, there was noted improvement. We were getting better at making movies. And this to me felt like it was this person's next step from that. It still felt like it was made on weekends down from college or something. But he managed to get Sam Raimi as a producer, and Sam Raimi actually went under a different name to produce it. It was some of the money from Evil Dead 2 went into producing it because he related to the kid who, Sam Raimi himself had made 8mm movies, Super 8 movies. I do feel like maybe this episode is the best time to really bring it up, but how much a movie costs really kind of should go into a legitimate review of that movie. When a movie costs 100%. So little, and it's not like you can certainly look it up online. Almost every movie you can find what the budget was on IMDb or Wikipedia, and you can mostly trust that number, expect it to be a little bit inflated, and expect it to rarely include the marketing costs of a movie, which also go into it. But when you look at the production cost of a movie and you can see what someone's working with, it suddenly becomes so much more forgivable to have cast it out of their circle of friends, or to have special effects that put ample blood above, actual knowledge of anatomy and things like that. It really is the more appropriate way to judge a movie. Never judge a movie based on how much it makes at the box office. That is probably the most pointless number, respectful to filmmaking on the art side. It's show business, and yeah, that number means a lot to the business side, but the show side, a movie's take at the box office means zilch. How much a movie costs to make means almost everything at this point in my life, as 100%. I'm looking at these. And Dead Next Door is a great example of that. It was a blast. Certainly you're going to have, I'm not going to recommend it for anybody who doesn't have a taste for low budget horror, but it is what it is, and it's good at what it is. And it happens to be, oddly enough, I didn't know this until we started to study 1989, but it is one of 4 films featuring Bruce Campbell that year. Bruce Campbell does not play any physical character in The Dead Next Door, but thanks to that great connection to Sam Raimi, this guy was able to get Bruce Campbell to do voiceover for 2 of the actors, because I'm assuming if it was Super 8, they recorded no sound anyways. So Bruce Campbell is the voice of the star, whose actual name is Raimi. I don't know if he's Detective Raimi or Inspector Raimi or what. And then he's also the voice of Commander Carpenter on the other side. So really? I didn't know that. So if you listen, that's crazy. When Raimi shows up, he's very clearly Bruce Campbell's voice. He's speaking with that Bruce tone. By the time you see Commander Carpenter, Bruce is going into actor mode and doing he's definitely
That's so crazy.
affecting a voice, and there's even moments where those two characters are together. Unfortunately, they never have dialogue towards one another, but they do take shots at one another. So you have Bruce Campbell versus Bruce Campbell for a very brief second, a few years before you ever got to Army of Darkness and Evil Ash. But
that's so wild. And then the weird Raimi thing is that, even watching it without knowing the Raimi connection at first, I would definitely say J. Burke Walter is not somebody known for interesting camera movement. But there's a few shots in this movie where he's definitely aping or trying to be Sam Raimi in the Evil Dead films, where it's whatever technique he was using is very much nowhere near as effective. But definitely, it's like he's wearing that influence on his sleeve. But that's interesting. I didn't know that. That is crazy. And maybe now I have to rewatch it with that knowledge. A movie I won't get into real quick. I just need to mention just because of the budget. While you mentioned that about how the Dead Dick Store might have been jealous of the budget of
Moonstalker.
Moonstruck. What is it?
Moonstalker.
What?
Moonstalker.
Thank you. The film Things, I think, was probably jealous of the Dead Next Door's budget. I don't know if you've ever seen Things. I'm blanking on the guy's name.
I have not seen this, by the way.
It is fucking. It's a lot. I will say this. It is a lot of fun. The guy, Andrew Jordan, who directed it, was like, he did a bunch of home movies. And this was like his biggest release. It was shot on video, made over I think 2 years of on weekend shoots. I mean, it's an anthology film. And it's as low budget. It's the lowest budget sort of film I've ever seen that's still got a pretty big Blu-ray release. I don't know if it was Severin, Intervision, I forget who put out the Blu-ray, but if you go in knowing how much the movie cost and the fact that it was basically a complete amateur filmmaker who had done a lot of before he made a lot of short films before this was submitted to film festivals, and I think he directed local television commercials, but there is a charm and a real love, and it's a weird anthology film. A lot of the gore and the special effects are pretty cheesy, but in a way that's kind of embraces the low budget aspect of it, and it's sort of very has some memorable moments. But if you're a fan of low budget filmmaking, low budget horror, it's definitely worth a watch, just because it's as low budget filmmaking as you can possibly get, and again, non-actors, and there's a charm. There's definitely a charm to it. I don't think it's. Some people heralded it when I remember when I think it was Severin first put it out. I remember seeing people saying it was the best release of this year, and the most underlooked film of all time. No, it's not. It's a low budget horror movie made by people with no experience or maybe even real talent, but it's got a charm to it. It definitely has a charm to it, but it is what it is. But it's definitely worth. I would definitely say if you're a fan of low budget horror, it's definitely worth a watch, just because there's probably been a million movies just like it made that don't have that same level of charm. So
I'll definitely check it out. Anthology horrors are kind of an in vogue thing right now too. There's a new documentary about them, and I would love to make an anthology horror one of these days. And that, for anyone that doesn't know, anthology horror is like Creepshow and Tales from the Crypt and that sort of thing. To keep with the low budget Bruce Campbell stuff for half a second, there's actually a couple I know that we can talk about. And well, actually all three of the rest of them I know that we would have opinions on. The one I'm going to bring up is the one I'm not sure if you've seen or not, because I had not seen it until recently myself. And it's a low budget science fiction horror movie called Moontrap.
That was the other one. It was it wasn't Night. It was Moontrap and then Moonstalker. No, I haven't seen that one either.
Okay, Moontrap, I really enjoyed it. I don't know how much sci-fi we'll actually get into because there's so much horror to explore, but I will point out that part of why sci-fi may be deficient in 89 is because this was a big year for sci-fi merging with horror. It seemed like a lot fewer things were able to be explained away by ancient curses or kids reading a text they're not supposed to read, or the various other reasons for boogeymen to come out of the shadows. In 1989, you really started to see a lot of science fiction based stuff, which I think was a lingering effect from Alien and The Thing.
That's great.
And a couple of films we'll get into later will literally have to do with those two. Moontrap on its own, it stars Walter Koenig in the lead role, Star Trek's Chekhov.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I have seen this movie. That's right. That's right. Again, I've seen so many. Yes, it's a fucking weird ass movie where Walter Koenig and Bruce Campbell are like best friends, like partners.
They're best buddy astronauts. You know.
That's right.
They're flying around in a space shuttle like buddy cops.
That's right.
They're Starsky and Hutch of the stars.
That's right. And weirdly, yeah. And then Walter Koenig is the star of it. Yeah, it's a weird ass movie, man. It's I for some reason thought that was early 90s, but yeah, I guess 89.
It's another thing that's tricky about 89 is, and I found this with a lot of films, including a couple of the Bruce Campbells here. They were released theatrically in 89 in sometimes smaller markets, and then released in the United States on home video in the early 90s and on HBO and Cinemax around that same time. So some of these movies were released technically in 89, but we didn't get our hands on them till the early 90s. So that's probably where your memories of Moontrap are coming from. Like, it may have been a new release.
It's a very weird movie,
but
it's, first off, I never wanted to see Walter Koenig as like a romantic lead ever.
You know, that's a little unsettling.
I don't think anybody was asking for that, but yeah, I don't know the actress's name, but I mean, the lead actress was very attractive too, but it's a weird movie, man. I from what I remember, I think they were supposed to be, am I wrong? Or does it have like a sort of an open-ended ending where it was sort of like, look out for a sequel kind of ending? Am I wrong about that?
I can't remember. I know. Yes, it was, because what it is they land on the moon. Or no, what it is before they even get to the moon, Bruce Campbell and Walter Koenig are flying around space, as they do. And this is the not too distant future, but they're talking about the moon and how Walter Koenig never got a chance to go there because he was the appropriate age to have been an astronaut when they walked on the moon in the late 60s. They end up finding a spaceship, and they go into the spaceship and in their big suits. And Walter Koenig finds like this egg sort of thing and like this corpse sort of thing. And, you know, as you're gonna do when you find a weird alien egg, you think, well, let's bring this back to Earth and see what happens. And so they bring it back to Earth. And what comes out of it is actually some weird kind of machine. The egg births a machine instead of birthing like an organic being.
Organic creature. Yeah.
But the machine, in order to grow, needs other parts, and it starts using humans as other parts, as its spare parts. There's even a line in the movie like, "Oh my God, we're spare parts."
That's right.
And so Walter Koenig and Bruce Campbell have to go to the moon, and Walter Koenig finally gets his moon landing moment so that they can go and find if there's other creatures on the moon that could be invading the world, and find that this race of like robot beings has existed since before us and has a huge base on the other side of the moon that was always been disguised from us as a crater, I think it was. And, you know, alien bad guyness ensues. There's nothing really groundbreaking about it. It's just an admirable little science fiction movie. Again, with the budget, for the budget that they had, this was a really ambitious movie. And I understand Walter Koenig's want or need. Like around this time in the Star Trek universe, Sulu's about to get his own ship, and you know, Spock and Kirk are directing the movies themselves, and he wanted his little slice of fame. And he's not half bad. He's not all good either, but he's not half bad.
No, yeah, it's not.
He and Campbell actually have a certain kind of chemistry, although I will say Campbell does kind of carry the movie.
Yeah. Such a weird movie. Another weird Bruce Campbell movie. I don't know if you were sort of wanting to talk about this next, because I hadn't seen it until today. Or in fact, I haven't even seen. I've got probably about like another 5 or 10 minutes, but it's wrapping up. But I've seen enough that I can talk about it. I know you've seen it. Is Sundown, The Vampire in Retreat, which is the single goofiest fucking title of the year.
Awful title.
I don't think it needed the subtitle portion of it. Just like call it Sundown.
Would have been a much bigger movie if they just called it Sundown.
Yeah, but it's such a weird fucking movie. It's like it's a horror comedy. I don't even know. It's
Western.
First off, it's very. Thank you. That was the other one. Western. It's a Western sort of. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely got a Western vibe. But yeah, it's basically vampires of. Is it Arizona? Is that it's?
They're either Arizona or New
Arizona?
Mexico,
or Nevada.
Oh, Nevada. Okay, yeah, I think it is Purgatory, Nevada. That sounds right.
Yeah, Purgatory, Nevada. And it's basically vampires have decided that we're going to stop killing humans and drinking their blood and move to this weird town because this guy invented, basically it's like a plant substitute that's like a plant extract that they can turn into like a blood substitute.
Yeah, what is it, the new meat that you can get in burgers nowadays that they want everyone to try? What's it called?
Beyond Burger, yeah.
Beyond, okay, this is Beyond Blood. Okay, this is
exactly. This is well before True Blood too. I should point out. But basically, and so, but the machine who produces this in this town isn't working, so they need the inventor of it to come to town to fix it. Meanwhile, the town itself is having like a civil war because there are people in this town who are like, look, I don't want to do that. I'm just going to kill humans and drink their blood. It's easier. I don't want to be like, I don't want to be subservient. It's basically like there's like these portions of vampires in this town who are over it and don't want to have to rely on this like blood substitute.
It degrades them, they feel. It degrades their honor as vampires. They're born to be, or they're not born, they're made to be hunters. They're made to be humans evolved, and they're being held down.
That's right. And it's got a whole subplot with like the guy is coming out there with his family, and there's like this dude named Shane who's played by
Max Caulfield.
I'm blanking his name. Thank you. From who you may know from Grease 2, who plays like his wife's old suitor. Meanwhile, Bruce Campbell is the descendant of Van Helsing. Honestly, doesn't need to be in this movie. Completely pointless to even have the character in the movie.
He's completely pointless outside of. It's cool to see Bruce Campbell, playing a Van Helsing
with a terrible. That's right. It's just Bruce Campbell with a terrible mustache. It's a weird movie though. It's really charming. I actually the cast is great. I mean, David Carradine, a lot of there's like so many.
Mehmet Walsh.
Oh, that guy. Exactly. But it's such a goofy, weird movie that it like the fact that it even exists is weird. Like I don't know how that pitch meeting went, but the main star of it, the guy, the guy who plays the inventor and the dad of the family, he's the worst thing. Like he's the least interesting thing about the movie. Even like the little girls are more interesting than he is. But yeah, the vampires are all like charming in their own way.
Well, they all come from different eras too. There's kind of you can tell which ones are kind of the cowboy vampires because they're a little bit more surly and gruff, and
there's the Victorian vampires and
kind of like what We Do in the Shadows did years later. Not quite as pronounced, but you can tell it's these different kinds of vampires.
It's more subtle and stuff.
There's a pilgrim also, one who's leading the charge. Yeah. Oh, and Max Caulfield was definitely the Eurotrash version of the vampire, and I was glad that they kind of put in the Eurotrash. The 90s got into a lot of Eurotrash vampires, which is not my favorite version of vampires, but
no, but in its own way now, like it's like a like almost like a time capsule of that era. But then there's the whole subplot with like the two campers who witness their cokehead friend get killed by the vampires at the beginning, and it's like that also doesn't really even need to be there because it's sort of secondary to the real main plot and stuff. But anyways,
I'm just here to see Mehmet Walsh run through a fucking wall. That's
right.
I'm not doing anything. I'm tired. Well, here comes Dracula. Oh, I'm out of here. He runs out the. I'm surprised they didn't make like an Mehmet Walsh shaped hole that he walked through.
Hole in the wall. That's right. I love it. It's definitely it's a film that could only exist in 1989, but I'm glad it does. Even though it's a flawed movie, but
it was inventive. It was inventive, and Anthony Hitchcock's the director. He's best known for the two Waxworks movies, which are really cool horror movies. Also with Bruce Campbell in one of those, and he did what was it called? Total Eclipse, the one with Mario Van Peebles, where they're like werewolf cops.
Werewolf, yes, that's right. Isn't that 91, 92-ish?
Somewhere around there. I used to have, I think it was one of the first issues I got when I subscribed to Fangoria, had that on the cover. But Anthony Hitchcock's, I think, and he ended up doing Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth. So he was an interesting director. He should probably be given a little more credit than he's given nowadays, just for kind of doing these inventive things, like making a modern day vampire Western with David Carradine, and Bruce Campbell as Van Helsing. And big spoiler alert, David Carradine's Dracula. I know they call him Mardulac through the whole movie, Count Mardulac. But Count Mardulac is really Dracula. Oh my stars. And so it's filled with all these little kind of Easter eggy things. Just to close out the Bruce Campbell, I don't want to get too far into this.
This is the one I most wanted to talk about.
Yes. Well, and it's the one that's fitting to do it last because Bruce is actually hardly in it. In fact, part of the problem is that it's marketed as a Bruce Campbell movie and he's a cameo in the last scene. But do you want to talk about this one? Because I think it's a classic and I want to know what you have to think about it.
Yeah, it's actually, I would put it as one of my favorite slasher movies, which is a huge subject. I mean, it's a subgenre, or it's a genre that obviously I'm a big fan of, but I'm assuming we're talking about Intruder.
Yes, Intruder.
Okay, yeah. Does feature Sam Raimi though,
and Ted.
Yeah, and Ted's he's such a I feel like at some point Ted Raimi will get his own like sort of love. He's been and I'm blanking on the start, but in fact there's a movie I've been wanting to talk about. I only saw it this year, which is sort of where he plays a psychopath, like a killer. That's really interesting. I'm blanking on the name of it.
Skinner.
Thank you, Skinner. Thank you. That I feel like, why are more people fans of this movie? But anyways,
Lunatics: A Love Story is another one that I. Really
that's right. So I feel like at some point Ted Raimi will get his own. Like he's outside of just being the character actor from Xena and Hercules, I feel like he'll get his own. Like people, not that people don't love Ted Raimi. I just don't feel like he's done things outside of stuff with his brother. Or things that his brother directed that I think he's really good in. I think he has a lot of charisma. He has to play a certain type, obviously. He wasn't a leading man sort of role normally. But anyways, we're getting off topic. Intruder is basically a slasher set in a supermarket, like a grocery store, like a family-owned grocery store. Very unique setting. Everything takes place at night. It's got one of the... First off, I will say right now, I think it's one of my favorite endings. I think the reason I love it so much and put it on such a high list for me for slashers is because of how great the ending is, how unexpected the little twist at the ending is, that you've never seen that. I've never seen that twist ending before. And it's so clever. And so, I mean, very simple, but very clever. And the kills are great. The atmosphere is great. The fact that it all sort of takes place in this like very weirdly large, there's a lot of like weird, like nooks and crannies to this grocery store. A lot of inventive kills. I won't give away the ending, but I don't know if I buy the motive of the killer at the end.
Yeah.
As sort of like a reasonable excuse to kill all these poor kids trapped in this grocery store. But it's a really fun, super memorable little indie, slasher movie. I said, the Raimis,
Sam Raimi is rarely on screen. He's in a couple of things. There's a couple of cameos. He's been in a couple of Coen Brothers movies because they're old friends from back in the day. In fact, I think the Coen Brothers have referenced elements of Intruder in some of their films. But Raimi's actually a side character in this, you know?
He's exactly. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those movies that like, basically anytime I either remember Intruder or if I'm like looking through my movies and I see it, I'm like, fuck, I want to watch Intruder. I haven't seen it in a while. It's just a movie that I think is a lot of fun. Again, I think the ending is so great and brilliant and something that, like I said, I'm just surprised it had never been done before, really. It's just so clever. At least nothing that comes to me off the top of my head, but it's definitely a fun little movie. But yeah, Bruce Campbell is literally in it for probably less than, I don't know, like a minute. Like he's it's the most minimal screen time they have his name on the movie. But yeah, it's a great movie though.
It is. And it touches on something. I'm sure you probably get this too. And it has nothing to do with horror. It's something that I think I always felt like was a weird thing about me, but I'm learning more and more other people feel the same way. But because it's a movie set in a grocery store, I spent half of the movie with the pause button ready to go because I'm like, oh my God, I remember when Sugar Smacks looked like that. Or like, look at those Pepsi bottles. Yes. I remember that display. Like, does everyone remember that display for Pepsi that was a giant can that had like the constantly spiraling Pepsi coming out of it and just wanting to touch it growing up?
Well, it's still one of my favorite scenes in Cobra. Because I literally always I remember it, and the little plastic fake swirl of soda.
But yeah, you get. I don't think 100%. That exact one is in Intruder. There is a giant Pepsi can, I think, at one point. But yeah, Intruder is chock full of those little moments for children of the 80s to kind of sit by with their pause button and wax nostalgic. On top of the fact that, like you said, it is a genuinely good slasher film. And that's saying something, especially coming from you. You were my go-to guy for slasher movies. So for this to be that high up on your list should be evidence for everybody. If that's a genre that you enjoy, you need to see.
Yeah, and I feel Intruder. Like it does enough different than the standard, slashers, that even the vibe of it is a little different. Obviously, it's one inventive kill after another, and it's sort of a, a lot of it is a whodunit style slasher. But yeah, there's just a charm to it. And again, I think even like the actors are really solid in it. The misdirections in it are pretty interesting. Like you think it's this character who shows up and he's a psychopath. Or you think like there's a lot of those things that sort of just add to the overall like enjoyment of the film. It's definitely one of those films where like I totally get why not a lot of people have seen it. But for those that, people who I think would really enjoy it, I always super like, yeah, you need to watch Intruder.
To take kind of a wide turn here, there were a number of really bizarre movies in 1989, as if we haven't already gotten into several of these, but bizarre even compared to the ones we've already mentioned. And I know you've got a couple of these already set up on a list. I think we'll have a couple of these back and forth. But I'm going to start things off with Sangre. Have you ever seen Sangre?
Of course, yeah. I think it might. I was thinking last night, I'm like, I think it might be the last great Jodorowsky movie. I think it's the last truly great Jodorowsky movie. It's very different from everything else that came out that year. It's very Jodorowsky, if you know what I mean by that. So, but yeah, go ahead and talk about it.
Like you said, it's directed by Jodorowsky, who was he Mexican or was he Spanish? Or I should say, he's actually tense. He's still alive.
Yeah, he is. I think he's Chilean, but grew up in Mexico, or I think he was definitely born in Chile. Weirdly enough, I had just watched, just like 3 weeks ago, I'd watched for like the fourth time the Jodorowsky's Dune, the documentary, just because that movie just makes me excited to do art every time I watch it.
Jodorowsky's Dune, had he been able to produce his version of the novel Dune, it probably would have changed the entire industry. I don't know whether that's a positive or negative.
About it, the fact that, yeah. But again, I think the fact it still changed the industry, even though it didn't get made, because the people he put together to make it kind of went off and, made some great shit. But yeah, anyways, yeah.
But yes, if anyone gets a chance, there is a great documentary about Jodorowsky's version of Dune. But Jodorowsky did successfully make El Topo and Holy Mountain. And if you're a fan of the avant-garde, you definitely know who Jodorowsky is. He's really out there. El Topo is the first kind of surreal Western. I know people like John Lennon were notorious fans of El Topo.
People do say it did invent the midnight movie. El Topo was single-handedly responsible for movie theaters running a movie at midnight because of its popularity, its cultish popularity. So a lot of people consider El Topo the very first quote-unquote midnight movie.
And this is his take on the horror film. Again, Sangre. It has some American titles, some English titles too, and I can't remember what they are right now, but generally everyone at this point has accepted Sangre as the title. So if you're searching for it, I should be able to find it under that. It's almost impossible to explain what it's about. Jodorowsky did not write it himself. It was brought to him to direct by the writer, and Jodorowsky only agreed to write it or agreed to make the film because he said, well, you're going to have to allow me to rewrite it because you've just handed me a dream that I've had. And he maintained that he dreamt this story himself, and now it's being presented to him as somebody else's writing. And he says, well, I've got to be able to make it my own, but I will make it. And make it he did. And I'm trying to think of even the best entry point into it. It starts with a child who's in a traveling circus, and his mother is a part of this weird cult that worships a girl who was murdered and had her arms ripped off.
Yeah.
And so, and the father is like this, he's like the circus strongman, but he's in drag. What was his whole thing?
Does he throw knife? He's like the knife thrower, I thought.
He's the knife thrower too, and he's
like the head of the circus or whatever.
Yes, but he's got this long blonde wig on, and he's definitely like male machismo in a dress is maybe the best way to put it. I don't know if does he actually wear a dress, or he's very effeminate for how much. Well,
there's the giant. There's the female giant.
This is already too confusing for our.
It's a weird movie. If you know Jodorowsky movies, it's he was a big fan of Dali and stuff.
I think Roger Ebert said something along the lines of Sangre is what if Luis Buñuel had directed Psycho.
There you go.
Because there are all sorts of mother issues involved in this as well.
Oh, well, that's the major theme, is that there's a lot of creepy. There's a lot to unpack with the movie. But it's visually very striking. A lot of design elements. There's weird, some things feel like the set of fucking the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. There's like weird, like,
yeah, literally at one point, like,
it's a very interesting, yes, it's a lot of like, there's a lot of like, artistic choices visually, and you can tell again, didn't have a big budget, but he made it feel like its own world. And like, I mean, the thing is, like, anytime you incorporate anything to do with like the circus and like that end of like, the movie's going to be weird to begin with. The circus is just, if you would naturally have circus type characters, sideshow type characters, those movies are always going to be weird or unsettling for people, just because again, we have a lot of things that we associate with those things. But take that and then add the director fucking Holy Mountain on top of that, it's going to be a weird movie. But again, there's a poetry to the movie, and again, it's, some people think, I've heard people criticize Jodorowsky because they think like he doesn't have any sense of humor, like he takes himself way too seriously.
Oh no, this movie was hysterical. Yeah, all of his stuff is funny.
So I don't know. People say like he takes himself too seriously. I've always felt like he does have a sense of humor about what he does. That there are people either love him or hate him. But I do think Son de Sangre is the last film of his where I felt like was truly of the same quality of like as like El Topo or Hono. I haven't seen that newest one of his films though completely. I only saw a thing about it, I think, on just like a 15-minute thing about it on YouTube or whatever about like him making it. But I do need to see his newest one. But
I do too. It sounds like you've seen even more than I have. I'm always going to be interested in what he's doing.
I know that the Criterion put out that like all of his like his the films he produced in Mexico, like the short movies and like the more like arty movies he did. I thought you owned that. I know I watched that with somebody.
I did. I had the DVD that came out, the box set that came out about, oh God, like what was that, 10, 15 years ago, that had Holy Mountain and
15 years ago, yeah.
I can't remember now if Son de Sangre was a part of that.
I remember like though it had like a bunch of like of his like art film, like before he actually released El Topo, they had like his like,
Fando,
there was no like real dialogue. Yeah, exactly. But anyways, glad you brought that up because I was wondering if we were going to talk about it, because again, it sticks out like a sore thumb from the rest of the films of that era, but not on the same level. But a film that is also very weird that I also have a huge soft spot for, and I believe it's a third film by the same director that year, is Society. Brian Hughes' Society, which I do feel like is Brian Hughes' like his seminal work as a director.
Yeah, that's his Citizen Kane.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a film that still holds up to this day. It's mostly known for talking anus man, talking anal butt face man. I'm a real butt face. Ha! Fucking bizarre movie. But yeah, you take all of the things that happened in the last act and all the creepy, gross, physical, like body horror stuff. Even if you take that out of it, it's still a really compelling film about paranoia and about class. The main kid in it, the kind of the protagonist, I really like his performance in it. Like, I feel like he's really like trying to be a stereotypical 80s, teen actor, but adding this whole layer on top of it. And I don't know, I feel like it's one of the films that, like, yes, it is mostly well known, and rightfully so, for all the effects work and all the creepy grossness that happens at the very end.
What do they call it? Shunting? Is that
the shunting? Yes, exactly.
The shunting scene is not for the weak of heart.
No. But there's a lot of really creepy, gross things that are through the whole movie. A lot of weird, like even not even the special effects or the like those scenes, like the overall vibe of it's really gross and creepy and
it is
sexual, and
the whole movie feels a little slimy.
Yes.
And everything
it's an uncomfortable movie to watch.
It is, and a lot of stuff's out of place. Like he catches someone, taking a shower kind of, through the fogged glass of the shower door, and it looks like they're standing face forward, but her tits are on her back. Yep. Like a lot of things like building up, like you will find that even that weird anomalous moment will have an explanation by the end when everyone starts walking a little backwards or sideways or kind of in the shunting, ladies and gentlemen. Just beware of the shunting. I agree. Billy Warlock, I think, was the name of the actor. I think he did a good job. There was one thing I picked up about him, though. I don't know whether this is a compliment or a criticism. It's just something I noticed that I enjoyed. And I felt like he was trying to do an impression of Emilio Estevez doing an impression of Michael J. Fox. I
have no idea. I'm gonna have to rewatch the movie because that's such a specific reference.
It did. I mean, he was acting very much like the Emilio Estevez sort of jock, the classic Breakfast Club jock, and every now and again he'd throw in kind of a Great Scott sort of moment, oh gosh, Doc, that sort of thing. Like his performance seemed to come equally from both places, but meld into something that was actually pleasant enough for this kind of a movie, which pleasant is not a word to describe any other element. Again, that's not a knock. No. This Usna is, along with David Cronenberg, Brian Usna is one of the kings of body horror. He's responsible for, he didn't direct the first Reanimator, but he produced it. And then
he was a producer at first.
And then he directed the sequels to the Reanimator, that kind of body horror. And which, if you're a fan of body horror, Reanimator is really kind of the upper echelon. The Reanimator is one of my favorite things ever. And in fact, I actually did go back and watch Bride of the Reanimator recently because I was thinking about Society. And I couldn't remember whether he did Bride or Society first. Society, though, I think is probably his best movie that he directed anyways.
Oh, hands down. And Bride of Reanimator is a fun movie. In some ways, I actually find it more rewatchable. I think just because you just go right into the bananas of it being a Reanimator film, and it goes, it's basically like, Reanimator turned up to the next level, and there's a lot of creepy, again, a lot of weird body horror stuff in it, and like a lot of creepy over the top designs. But Society feels like it's like, and this is by no means a knock on the Reanimator films, but the Society feels like a personal statement, like a vision. Like it feels like, he's not as talented of a director as say a Cronenberg, but it's him trying to tell them a more like personal point of view, or he's trying to make a more political statement where the Reanimator films are about fucking dead bodies and fucking heads flying around bat wings. Like,
of course, it gives Eat the Rich a new definition. That's right. And it's definitely a matter. The Society is going to fuck you is basically the overriding thought, and this movie starts to build up towards a literal version of that in a way that is entirely creepy and violating and gets under your skin in all the ways that a body horror movie should get under your skin. So yeah, highly recommended on Society. I would actually call that a 4-star movie, although I don't think it's been treated as a 4-star movie until in the last couple of years. But that was one that I've defended for quite some time.
I said earlier that he had directed 3 movies. I just to make certain, I forget that Brian Usna directed Silent Night, Deadly Night Part 4 and 5. He didn't do Part 3. That was Monty Hellman. I know a lot of people hate Silent Night, Deadly Night Part 3 though, for legitimate reasons, but I do have a soft spot for it. Mainly because Chop Top himself, Bill Moseley, is the killer with a visible brain element, which is so cartoonish and over the top, but I love it. But yeah, for some reason I kept thinking that was Brian Usna, but it's Monty Hellman. Usna directed the equally weird parts 4 and 5. So
yeah, Silent Night, Deadly Night 3 was not one of my favorites of '89. I really like Monty Hellman as a director. I mean, he did a lot of great stuff in the 70s. He did a lot of like Westerns with Jack Nicholson and Two Lane Blacktop with Warren Oates. And
that's the thing that, I think that's the one thing that always comes to mind.
Yeah. And it's the only, what's his name? Taylor, the singer. James Taylor.
James Taylor, yes.
Yes, he directed James Taylor's only acting performance.
His balding long hair in the movie.
Yes. Yeah. that was Two Lane Blacktop. Those are all legitimate classics. He also produced Reservoir Dogs. Yeah, Monty Hellman directing Silent Night, Deadly Night 3. Bill Moseley is the killer and Robert Culp is the cop. All of the ingredients are there to be awesome, and it's just not.
But it's just not. No.
Yeah,
it's very. One thing too is it's very slow. Like for all the elements, it's way too boring of a movie, which I think is mainly probably what most people would say its criticism is. I don't want to talk about a lot, but I do feel like I need to mention this was also the year because I don't think you mentioned it when you were talking about all the different franchises, but it was the very first Puppet Master movie.
Yes,
and it's people don't understand that the first 2. I love the first 3. But it's actually not as terrible. Like they're not the franchise that it turned into, say, like Axis of Evil. Like it was actually a pretty well-made, creepy little movie.
It had some atmosphere.
There's a reason it caught on. Is that they were actually pretty well. The first one was actually a pretty well-made, pretty well-acted movie. The fact that Charles Band, the fact that he owned that castle in Europe and he filmed a lot in Europe, they added this authenticity to a lot of those early full moon films, and this is, I think, probably this and the first subspecies, like it really felt like a classier or bigger movie. I think 13 sequels altogether with Puppet Master, something around there. It's like an unearthly amount of sequels, more than I think even most people realize are out there, with reboots, and then there's even like there's like multiverse concepts. It's a weird franchise, but I do have a lot of fun memories. I think the early full moon stuff was such a big thing between me and my twin brother. We'd rent all of them, and again, I feel like it was really important. Puppet Master is sort of like full moon's, their fucking ticket. It's like they're like Mickey Mouse. Like, they made some other franchises that did well, but Puppet Master's like what they're known for. And the first Puppet Master is actually a really well-made film for what it is. So I felt like I as a fan, and I feel like it needed to be said.
Absolutely. No, Puppet Master is a better film than it gets credit for. I mean, Paul LaMatte's in it, who is an Oscar nominee for, was it Melvin and Howard? I think he was nominated for an Oscar for, and probably best known for American Graffiti. And William Hickey, who's probably best known as the old uncle in Christmas Vacation, has a brief spot in the beginning. And so the acting's actually, well, he paid to get some of the acting in there. I don't know. None of these people are giving their best performance. I can say that.
No, but still, but there is a class to it that I think people don't.
Yeah, I think it gets kind of locked into being super schlocky, and I think there's a little bit more to it to at least the first one than most people are giving it credit for. And you can definitely see why it became a franchise. And I think you could make easy arguments that the first one is not the best of the series either. But when you've got 13 movies, there's something for everybody.
And like I said, I feel like that's why I feel like the first one, again, people think Puppet Master, like all full moon movies, are like, Killer Condom or fucking like the Ginger Dead Man, like that they're these super campy, stupid. And
they progressively got
it's about
there.
Killer puppets,
or I don't know if progressively is the right word, but
no, I do think they got dumber and dumber as they went on. But I think I think the first few were actually quality films. I do think part 2 is my personal favorite. I think it's one of the better. Like, I think it's probably, in my opinion, the best of the franchise. Part 3 is also really good.
You can't talk about 1989 without bringing up Pet Semetary, because that was probably the big one of 1989. Like that's the one that even your non-horror fans are going to gravitate towards, and for good reason, because Pet Semetary, even amongst his most loyal fans, most people agree that Pet Semetary is one of the best Stephen King movies.
Well, it's funny. Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up. I would say it's the last. So he's had his resurgence in the last like 5 years, where all of a sudden, like he's consistently had adaptations of his work. Always. I mean, every few years in some form or another.
Mick Garris will do something. And
exactly. But if his golden age of Stephen King, which is basically from Carry On, it's definitely his last great adaptation of his work. And after this, it was a fucking steady decline of like Langoliers and made for TV shit and a lot of not so good stuff. But Pet Semetary is great. And it's so many weird little elements of it that still make it, to this day, again, I think. I haven't actually seen the remake fully. I started watching it. I thought it was pretty good, but I just didn't finish it. Got distracted. But I thought it was pretty good. But
I'd like to see it. I haven't seen it either. But the original, I remember seeing it with my dad when I was 10. I think my mother is still pissed off. And I somehow managed to get my 6th grade teacher to allow us to watch it in class. I don't know how I did that one. He was a little bit of an older guy, so I'm sure he was just in a certain level of I don't give a shit mode. But I brought in Pet Semetary and he allowed us to show that. It was a seminal one for me. It wasn't what made me a Stephen King fan, because growing up in the 80s, of course, I was very aware of who he was and was already a fan of Silver Bullet and whatever I basically had access to, Maximum Overdrive, for better or worse, things like that, Cujo, and the list goes on and on, Firestarter. Pet Semetary was the first one, though, that when I saw that, again, at 10, that was the first one that I said, I think I'm going to have to give this guy's books a shot too. And so Pet Semetary became the first Stephen King book I read. And from there, it was all over. I spent the rest of my adolescence just being a King head and reading anything I could get my hands on and finding a second appreciation to the movies I had grown up with. Pet Semetary. Oh, and again, another interesting thing about What Ifs. Pet Semetary was almost directed by George Romero, and also almost starred Bruce Campbell, which would have been cool.
I did not know that. What?
Yes. My guess is that the studio probably said who, but
Probably.
yeah, and went with
Prime.
Dale Midkiff, who I think either just before Pet Sematary or just after Pet Sematary, one or the other, had played Elvis. He was the actor I most associated with playing Elvis in my childhood as well, even more than Kurt Russell. When I was a kid, I thought of Dale Midkiff as Elvis.
The Kurt Russell one, I think, was a little bit too old for us, but still.
Yeah, it came out the year I was born, the Kurt Russell one.
Yeah.
So I discovered that later. The other big casting, of course, everybody in the whole movie is great, but the idea of seeing Fred Gwynn outside of the Herman Munster outfit also just blazed into my mind permanently. He was so cool.
Yeah, he's a legend. But yeah, the same. I mean, there's a Zelda. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can think about when that movie first. It will always be Fred Gwynn will literally be always the first thing I think about when somebody mentions Pet Sematary, and then the awesome Ramones song, which is probably one of my favorite. Theme songs from a movie ever. Like
it's a title song, I guess you can call it.
Title song. It's fucking amazing
because that's his favorite band. So I know he was personally thrilled to have the Ramones doing a song for one of his movies. That was probably a highlight of his film career.
I bet that and cocaine.
It's still the 80s.
Exactly. I mean, Ramones and Stephen King. I mean, those are two of my favorite things as a young man. I still sometimes Son's facial hair will get the random, you know who you look like comment, and inevitably, God, I love Stephen King. Don't know if I want to look like Stephen King, but I get it.
You're better looking than Stephen King.
A few times
I promise our audience that James is better looking than Stephen King.
As in my early 20s with a certain haircut, I could see it. But anyways, it's a movie that I totally get. It's one of those films that, like you said, I think you said even really, you stated it really well. I have friends that don't even like horror movies or don't watch horror movies, and they will always bring up like, oh, I love Pet Sematary. It's one of those movies that transcended the genre and was sort of like a big hit and a big thing for that time.
And there's nothing more terrifying than the loss of a child, too. I mean, it hit a universal audience with that. Also, on the surreal level was Bob Balaban's Parents. I don't know if you're a fan of Parents.
I loved it as a kid. I haven't seen it in 20 years, but it was one of the very first like black comedy, one of those first like sort of like satirical horror comedy type things. I was a big fan of it. Weirdly, like as a kid or like, in my early teens or whatever, but I haven't seen it in a long time. I don't know if somebody put it out a few years ago and I've always been like, oh, I need to grab that. But just, it's not one I've picked up recently, but I was a big fan of it for years. Like again, it's very ahead of its time with it being sort of, like I said, there's a satirical, dark humor aspect to it. But yeah, why don't you talk about it?
It's another one, like you said, I watched it as a kid and I wasn't sure how to place it as a kid. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be laughing or if I was supposed to be scared or quite what. And I think that was a matter of, I was watching it too young. I don't think that was the fault of the movie and the movie not being able to decide what it wants to be. It is a satire. Yeah. It's a satire of parenthood, it's from the perspective of the child. So it's not satirizing parenthood from the perspective of like, oh, those crazy kids. No,
being a parent.
It's about being a kid and being terrified by your parents who want you to be like them and you do not want to be like them. And in this case, maybe the best way to put it is to just say what the title was in Germany. The title of this movie is Daddy ist und Cannibal.
Pretty easy to decipher.
Yes. I don't know how to pronounce cannibal in German. I'm realizing now that I say it out loud.
Cannibal.
But yeah, his parents are cannibals and are really into cooking. It looks like liver. I don't know. It's always the same kind of meat that they're cooking. And it looks so disgusting and just unappetizing without even knowing that it's supposed to be human meat and trying to get this kid to eat it. And this kid refuses to eat it. He's kind of your typical 80s dark kid, kind of like your Lydia Dietz. Not quite as goth, exactly. But, withdrawn, quiet in school.
Not over the top, but definitely that loner kind of kid.
And it takes place in the late 50s, early 60s. I think they might actually put a date in the movie, but I can't remember what it is now. the parents are very model parents, and the dad is actually played perfectly by Randy Quaid, which I have to point out what a tragedy. I talk about Randy Quaid as if he's already dead. It's
as he, yeah,
because he may as well be at this. But yes, I don't know what's going on with him. I truly, there are artists that I disagree with politically, but I still highly respect them as artists. Randy Quaid, I don't disagree with him. I actually really hope he gets some help. I think it's a matter of some sort of imbalance. He's off his meds or on the wrong meds, or he's going through something. And I really hope he gets help with that, because I want Randy Quaid back. He is such an interesting actor. Obviously best known as Cousin Eddie and kind of playing these sort of white trash doofuses, but he has so much more range than that. When you look at something like The Last Detail or The Last Picture Show, his 70s movies that he came up with.
Yep.
And this is definitely that Randy Quaid in this movie, playing a very straight-laced mid-century father. You definitely read in his portrayal that he doesn't think he's doing anything wrong, and that he's just a good American. He's just doing what any dad would. He just happens to be a cannibal and trying to teach his kid how to be a cannibal like him. And there's a lot of creepiness concerning the mother as well. But you start to get the feeling that this is really an attack on bad fathering and bad parenting in general, in terms of how much a person will be willing to allow their spouse to go too far for the sake of keeping the status quo in the house, and allowing themselves to be victimized to the point that they are actually as guilty as the bad guy. I don't know. I don't know exactly. I lost my train of thought in the wording there, but my point is hopefully clear. Because I do feel like the mother on some level is being victimized. You also have an interesting performance by Sandy Dennis as the high school counselor, who starts to see that there's a problem with this kid and wonders what's going on at home, and ends up getting involved and wishing that she hadn't gotten involved, of course. And the reason I bring up Sandy Dennis, on top of the fact that I just love Sandy Dennis, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is probably my favorite movie of all time, and she won an Oscar for that. But she plays real off-the-wall sort of baddie characters. And she plays another baddie character in 1989 in the film 976 Evil, which is a movie that really belongs to the 80s, because who even gets the reference of what 976 as a prefix is anymore? And if you watch it again, it starts, the first sound is a dial tone. This is a movie that's really only for 80s kids, directed by Robert Englund, Freddy Krueger himself, and starring Stephen Jeffries, best known as Evil Ed in Fright Night.
The most reluctant horror actor of all time.
I know. I feel bad for the guy.
Not a fan of his what he's known for.
No, he's returned to doing horror again. But
Robert De Niro, but
yeah,
has he?
Yeah, he's. I found this out only recently in redoing the research. A couple of people have gotten him to. I don't know if he's gotten like a full starring role again, or whether all just cameos, but it literally feels like he finally just reached that point. Well, I've already done porn, and now I'm out of that money, so I guess I may as well go back to doing horror movies that I hate. So there's this little sadness to him returning to horror, but
he's if you ever see any of the documentaries he's in, he is one of the few that are openly bitter that he got famous for being Evil Ed, which is unfortunate. But
because Evil Ed was a very weird,
creepy little movie.
Yeah, 976 Evil.
Yeah,
I don't. You go ahead and take us on 976 Evil. I just mainly wanted to point out how 80s that as a concept is, but it is fun.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, if you're listening to this podcast and you don't get the reference, there was a time when 976 numbers were basically like a, as a service to charge you money. There was like party lines were really big, sort of infer things with this. But yeah, you could call these different services and, have a social life or whatever. And this character finds a card, is it 976 there's a devil reference in there.
So 976 Evil is the number, but then the code for the psychic reading is 666, because they're being real clever about it.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's like I said, it's mainly interesting because it was Robert Englund's directorial debut.
I think it would have been forgotten without that.
And again, the fact that like it was starring Evil Ed, like it was his like starring role, like horror starring role, because at that point, everybody, if you were a diehard horror fan, you knew him from Fright Night. I wanted to talk about this. So it was 89 was a very interesting year for Robert Englund because he had, Dream Child. He directed 976 Evil, and he starred in one of the two films based on Phantom of the Opera, 1989's Phantom of the Opera, which is a fucking pretty weird movie, but it's actually pretty interesting. I think I didn't like it when I saw it in my late teens, early teens, or whatever. Didn't like it. I thought it was really boring. And then I saw it again in my late 30s. And I'm like, wow, this is actually a pretty enjoyable movie. It's like a very like 80s style version of Phantom of the Opera. Like it's trying to be more gory or darker, and it's turning the Phantom into more of a slasher character. There's a lot of weirdness to it, like the design of it, which I guess I heard. Basically, Robert Englund plays the Phantom, the titular Phantom of the Opera. But in this film, and it's about Christine, and she's a opera ingenue or whatever, and he's trying to do everything to make sure that Christine is a star. But it's also like he's sort of Jack the Ripper. He's like killing prostitutes and stuff. But in this movie, instead of wearing a white mask, he wears the skin of the people that he kills to cover up his own deformed face. It's really weird, man. It's got this like sort of bookends that take place in modern time, but the rest of it takes place in like, the 1800s or the early 1900s. I don't know the exact time, but 20th or late 19th century, whatever. But it's an interesting film. I think he thought he was going to really break out and do something different than Freddy, but I get why it didn't succeed. There's a lot like the makeup choice for when he's like the Phantom makes him look like really over the top, goofy, weird. And I guess the influence was busts of Beethoven was like the look that they went for. And I'm like, that's a really weird decision.
Yeah, that is a little odd.
But he wanted to play like a romantic character. Yeah, it's really odd. Robert Englund wanted to really sort of, play a romantic character. And I'm like, I want that to work as a big fan of Robert Englund, but it doesn't.
Wasn't the one.
And I think mainly it's not even him. It's a goofy makeup. I used to say that I felt like it should have just been a modern, like cut out the old, like they're trying to go for like all the pomp and class of like the original and the setting and the Victorian setting. No, they should have been set in the modern time.
I agree.
Do something different. And the bookends, I think, sort of just make it more obvious that they should have gone in that route.
Yeah, but I agree.
But yeah, But
I would like to revisit it.
It's not a great movie, but I think you should. I think it's definitely worth a revisit. I was gonna say I think you definitely should.
I'd like to revisit it. It's one of those ones where it was only available on disc. I was going to watch it for this, but I couldn't find it anywhere. It was one of the rare instances where Tubi let me down. There were a couple, like Warlock. I really wanted to revisit, and Warlock is nowhere to be found. I'm not even sure that's on Blu-ray or disc anywhere right now.
It is. There's actually Vestron did the full. They did Warlock and Wishmaster. They released them like within like the same week, I think.
Okay.
The complete Wishmaster and the complete Warlock, and it's the perfect weirdly it's the perfect sort of like watch them both at the same time frame. But yeah, I haven't seen it. I actually own it, and I haven't seen any of the Warlock films probably in 15 years. I just remember thinking like Julian Sands, who our good friend Sonia was a giant fan of. He went from boxing Helena to the Warlock, and it's just sort of like poor Julian Sands.
I think it went the other direction though. I think he moved up to.
Was it?
I think he moved up to boxing Helena from Warlock, because boxing Helena in my head was an early 90s film, and Warlock is late 80s. But it's still a step. Warlock was after he did Room with a View, though, so it exists in this weird spot. Richard E. Grant is also in Warlock.
But he's great.
Actually, kind of a similar conceit to like the Terminator in a way, where they're time traveling, but they're time traveling to the future to take out something instead of time traveling back to the past to save the future. They seem to be time traveling to the future to save the past somehow.
Are there only 3 Warlock movies?
3 is all I can remember. I never even saw the third one. I did see the second one. And it was on Cinemax constantly. So, and the whole.
Well, that's the thing is exactly. I'm glad it was a cable favorite. It was on cable all the time. Warlock, the Armageddon, and then which was 93, and then The End of Innocence, which is such a lofty hoity-toity title. The Warlock 3, The End of Innocence from 99. I think that's probably why I kept, again, I would think of Boxing Helena and Room with a View, which is a fucking phenomenal movie. Then again, to Warlock, the Armageddon, it's just sort of like, whether he's being campy, which I think he's one of those guys that knows how to like be campy right. I think he's definitely a good actor if you've seen his non-genre stuff. Like, he's a great actor, and I think he knows how to play the right role for the right thing, even though he's still has this sort of like over the top English sort of arrogance to him. Like, he has this tendency to play similar roles, even if they're about magicians and shit. But either way, yeah. Or Warlock is a really fun movie. It's not a great movie, but it's fun. I haven't seen any of the three recently enough to give an in-depth, more critical analysis. I just remember being a fan of at least the first one. Like I said, I know I've seen them all because they were video rental store favorites and shit, but I remember the first one was pretty interesting.
We are wrapping up towards the end. There's definitely ones that I want to mention, but I don't want to do a two-parter for the first part of our three-parter. So... I do want to
really quick. I do want to mention really quickly one movie that, because it's got a lot of weirds. There's a lot to unpack with it, so I'll try to make this quick. But I do want to talk about it before we end, and that is unfortunately Victor Salva's Clown House.
Yeah, I wondered whether to even bring this one up.
I do. I feel like I have to bring it up. So Victor Salva, if you're a fan of this podcast, I think we might have talked about him already, even in passing. He's a human piece of shit. He's a child molester and a predator who was busted on this, for this movie. He was basically...
this wasn't a matter of this was a child molester making a movie. This was a movie directed by a child molester starring the child that he was assaulting behind the scenes.
Yes,
so there's a particular poisonousness to this one.
Yeah. But still, very inexplicable that he still had a career after this. He had Powder, and then he's most, famous for creating the Jeepers Creepers franchise. But despite its really disgusting and tragic history of the making of the film, it's weirdly a really compelling film. It's first off, it's a PG horror film, which aren't super common, especially in '89. That wasn't something that was really prevalent. But first off, it's got a very young Sam Rockwell in it.
I think it's his debut.
Yeah, I think it's his debut. But it's actually a fucking great... I'm someone who thinks scary clowns are overrated to begin with, and I do not like Victor Salva. In fact, I'm not a fan. I think Clowns is actually a really good movie. Like, it's unfortunate because it has this great vibe and atmosphere to it. It's genuinely creepy and scary, but it's also not like a gory slasher. It's more of a atmospheric sort of thriller about like a kid running away from escaped clowns. This kid has coulrophobia. He's afraid of clowns, and his brothers make fun of him. And just so happens that on this night, lunatics escape an insane asylum, and then they go to this carnival and basically kill these clowns and dress up as these clowns. And now they're like tormenting this kid and chasing him. But it's a fucking really... I remember the first time I saw it, I finished it, I was like, I couldn't believe how much I enjoyed it. And I completely rewatched it almost back to back. Be like, let me watch this again. And I was like, damn, I like it just as much the second time. And it's fucking really unfortunate because, one, it's made by a fucking piece of shit monster. And two, it will probably never get a release because it's made by a piece of shit monster. Even though they'll still make fucking new Jeepers Creepers movies and put money in the guys' pockets. It's just unfortunate because, again, I really enjoy the movie. Separating all of that as a movie, I really like it. But I completely understand why it will never get a release, and I support that decision because fuck Victor Salva. It's just unfortunate because, like I said, it's actually a pretty compelling little, well-made little horror movie. So
I remember really enjoying it when it came out. I mean, my only experience with it was a pure experience before knowing any of what we know now, unfortunately, between the star and the director. But watching it as a kid, and it's a story about a kid, and the story itself is not about, at least not that form of molestation. But
no. Although if you actually watch it now, there's a lot of creepy things. So like, there's a lot of shots of this kid in his little tighty whities, and there's.
See, that's why you're not going to see this movie released, given a major release.
Yeah.
And I get it. I usually fight for the art, not the artist sort of argument. But this one, it doesn't. It falls just outside of the gray area to me, and it falls in the black area of I cannot. I remember this film. I remember this film was well done. I will never watch it again because it's tainted for a very particular reason. But speaking of it as a film, I do remember it being effective. To take this into kind of a well, I think we could talk about any of these movies again to take it into a lighter note, but we shouldn't leave off 1989 and sci-fi horror without bringing up that this was really the year of the water monster.
I was going to say, and especially because some of these were some of the biggest movies of the year.
Yeah.
Weirdly enough, a lot of movies about water monsters.
I know I said I was just going to do one list in this episode because I had that giant list of sequels, but please forgive me. I do have a list of water films. We had The Abyss, Deep Star 6, The Evil Below, Leviathan, Lords of the Deep, and The Rift. With I'm willing to say that The Abyss was probably the object of desire in that grouping, in terms of, I'm willing to say almost every movie on that list was racing The Abyss to the theater. They were all trying to do The Abyss before The Abyss came out. Yeah. Like, it was a conscious thing, like Missing in Action and Rambo 2 were, in terms of like, oh, they're doing a big movie about a missing in action Vietnam vet. We got to do the same. This was very similar in that sense. In fact, you had some of the same people, like Sean Cunningham directing Deep Star 6. Sean Cunningham, one of my favorite producers, but not shy about the fact that he makes movies that are trying to capitalize on the success of other things. He came up with Friday the 13th because he was trying to capitalize on Halloween. You know, he's
an opportunist. He
made Deep Star 6 because he found out that James Cameron was doing a water movie and he was determined to come out first. Not a bad movie. I think we can kind of skip over The Abyss to a certain extent because we all know it's one of James Cameron's better films. And if you ever get an opportunity to see The Abyss, if it's ever put out on any format, because it hasn't been released in 20 years, you definitely owe yourself that, because Ed Harris is great in it. But for me, the two that are worth talking about are, like I said, Deep Star 6, which has an incredible cast, and Leviathan, which somehow has an even better cast than Deep Star 6. And what you basically have in one is Alien underwater, and in the other, it's The Thing underwater. Do you have a favorite water movie of 89?
It's funny because you think of like The Abyss and then James Cameron, and you think it's this like intense, and it's really not. It's pretty like,
it's Spielberg-y for James Cameron.
Exactly. That's what I was going to try. I was like, say it's very family friendly, but you said it's a Spielberg, Amblin-y, entertainment-y kind of film, where like Deep Star 6 and Leviathan are much more of a kind of a tense thriller, underwater thriller. Again, I don't even know if I would consider Leviathan. No, yeah, again, I mean, they're horror enough. Yeah, I mean,
Leviathan's definitely in my. If The Thing is horror, then Leviathan is horror.
I mean, the thing is, my mom loved all three equally, so I grew up with those movies being played a lot. I probably watch of the big three. I probably watched Deep Star 6 the least.
Same here.
I think that one was one my parents. I know we own The Abyss and Leviathan on VHS. I don't know if we own Deep Star 6 on VHS. Was probably the only reason we didn't watch it as much. But weirdly, I haven't seen the other ones. The Rift, Lords of the Deep, or whatever. And what was the third one? The other one? You said there was another one. It was Lords of the Deep.
The Evil Below.
Rift. Yeah, I
know nothing about that one. I know a little bit about Lords of the Deep. Mostly just what I remember it being brought up in Fangoria when I was a kid, but I never saw it. I agree with you. Deep Star 6 is a lesser film. It does have a really great performance by Miguel Ferrer, going completely psychotic and getting cabin fever in a underwater base. You've also got possibly the only cinematic performance. No, that can't possibly be true. But the main actor in Deep Star 6, I think of is Joey from My Two Dads, was the protagonist of Deep Star 6.
That's right, yeah.
And the Mahoney replacement from Police Academy is also in Deep Star 6. What's his name? Matt McCoy, I think. And he meets...
I will never forgive him for replacing Steve Guttenberg.
Well, he meets a pretty gruesome man in Deep Star 6, if you remember, because he's the one in the suit, in the deep water suit. And that's really the takeaway from Deep Star 6. That still gives me the creeps, this deep sea diving, what do they call it? Deep sea bell sort of. Bell diving.
Yeah, it's funny because I recently had watched that movie that came out last year, The Underwater, with, she's sort of most known for being the girl from Twilight, but she's actually a really great actress. I'm blanking on her name.
Kristen Stewart.
But I don't know if you've seen the movie Underwater.
I was interested. It certainly brought these movies we're talking about to mind when I saw the trailers. But I was curious about it.
And I'm not usually watch it.
Yeah, I'm not usually curious when it comes to her stuff, but that one actually looked interesting. And I was wrong about Robert Pattinson. I fully admit I was wrong about Robert Pattinson. So
yeah, with her, I think she's, people like just don't like her. She's sort of a hipster, whatever the thing that people put on her. But she's a great actress, and I think in this she was like really good as like an action star lead. I will say this: you should definitely watch it, and then we need to talk about it, because once you've seen it, you'll know immediately what I want to talk about. But either way,
okay.
But yeah, again, it reminded me of. I was like, when I finished watching, I'm like, shit, I need to rewatch, Leviathan and Abyss, because I haven't seen those movies in a while. I'm like, fuck, dude, like something
Leviathan
about being
is
trapped
worth
underwater
revisiting.
is already. I'm gonna buy it. Yeah.
Something about being trapped underwater. I didn't.
Kitties. Oh, I was just saying, there's something so scary about just underwater. First off, like, we've all seen those like creatures that have been discovered like from the deepest depths of the ocean, and they're how alien those creatures are. And obviously like the pressure of being underwater can, people can implode just from the pressure of, and then, drowning. There's just so much about like underwater is more, to me, more terrifying than outer space. And that there's something about, there's something so inherently creepy about being underwater as a human being that, like, when you add in like the monster movie element or the sci-fi element, I'm surprised there aren't more movies that tackle it. But again, then you sort of, I'm sure when the movie Underwater came out, everybody immediately went to, the Leviathan and Deep Star 6 comparisons. But it's just, what a weird random thing for 1 year to have that many underwater movies.
Yeah. I don't know what was in the water, but that wasn't meant to be a pun. And then I just ran with it about halfway through making the statement.
You have
to close out, there are a couple of honorable mentions here that I wish we could have gotten to. There's some foreign films that were really fantastic. Dial Code Santa Claus was 1989. Baxter, a French film about a killer dog that is not like Cujo. It's from the perspective of the dog, and it's voiceover with the dog, and the dog is a very calm sort of serial killer sort of persona. There's Meet the Feebles out of New Zealand, which, if you haven't seen Meet the Feebles, everybody should see Meet the Feebles at least once, and then promptly take a shower when it's finished. Peter Jackson, prior to The Lord of the Rings, making a Muppet movie, but these are the grossest, most disgusting, violent, drug-addicted, fornicating Muppets you've ever seen.
So I don't know if you saw that movie that came out, I think 2 years ago, about like the Muppet Town Murders or whatever it was called. I know a lot of people were like, oh, it's a new fucking Meet the Feebles.
No.
It's nowhere near. Meet the Feebles is one of the sleaziest feeling movies ever made.
I can't even say it's a good movie. I'm not sure I recommend it, even though I personally enjoyed it. What was it? The Happy Land Murders or something like that. The actual Jim Henson
Happy Land Murders. Yeah.
Movie. I couldn't get 5 minutes into that. It just, it didn't offend me. It offended me because it wasn't funny. If you're going to go that route, you have to back it up with being funny. You can't just be shocking for the sake of shocking. And part of that is because Meet the Feebles existed in 1989. If you want something for just shock value and the coolness, the hipster value of that, you already missed the boat by 30 years, buddy. Move on to doing something clever instead of just shocking. And then another film that I want to just throw out there real quick, because I think you had alluded to it before, and that's Tetsuo the Iron Man. And I don't know if you want to say a word about that before.
We'll
close out on that.
What do you say about Tetsuo the Iron Man? It's a black and white art film that's, became actually very, I won't say notorious, but it was a movie I remember when it got released over here that, everybody's like, it was almost like finding like a punk rock album, or I guess it would be the closest would maybe when Eraserhead first came out.
I was like just going to say Eraserhead.
That like, the people who knew about it were talking about, like, it was really like, it's basically a black and white stop motion movie about a man turning into a machine, and the music is very industrial and it's very artfully made. For me, it's one of the hardest movies to watch because it's so dissonant. Body Hammer, which is like the sequel, kind of an unofficial sequel that he made like 15 years later, I don't think it's as successful, even though it's a more accessible movie. It's more of an actual real movie. I don't think it works as well as Iron Man. Iron Man is one of the most, like, it's the closest I've ever seen to an art, like a little quote unquote like video art installation that is like it's one of those movies that you feel like you have to see at least once in your life. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but I feel like if you really like cinema, it's one of those movies that you just sort of have to see just to experience it. It's not for everybody, or not everybody's going to love it, but there's a lot of people out there who love it. Some people, my friend Sean considers it in his top 3 favorite movies ever made, which I definitely wouldn't go that far, but I do appreciate it. But it's just this crazy unnerving stop motion film about basically a guy that's turning into a machine. That's really the only way I can explain it.
You're right. It's very unsettling. Go into it prepared for that. Yeah. It's going to give you a lot of imagery that you're uncomfortable with, and that only leads to further confusion in a way, because you're so heightened sense-wise by what's happening. Like, you're certain things you can't watch without trying to somehow interpret how that would feel, because it's so outside of your experience. I sure hope nobody's experienced pain like what is in Tetsuo the Iron Man. But it's about becoming a machine, and there's nothing you can relate that to in your own personal experience. So while you're trying to digest the purpose and the meaning of that, you've also got this very fractured sort of storytelling going on, where they don't even give you the names of these characters. I think the names are all just in credit only.
Man, there's so many. I feel like we didn't talk about the Toxic Avenger films. I didn't get to talk about The Vineyard, which is a fucking crazy movie.
You know what? Let's say something really quick about The Vineyard, and let's do a trauma episode, and we'll get to talk about Toxic Avenger and Uncle Lloyd.
And again, if you're listening to this podcast, we didn't mention some of your favorite movies from this year. Granted, this year had a ton of horror films released. We couldn't get to them all. Yeah, The Vineyard. So basically, the film was a passion project for James Hong, who's probably the most prolific Chinese American actor ever, most notably for playing Lo Pan, the villain from Big Trouble in Little China. But he was trying to make his own movies. He was trying to like branch out, and there wasn't a lot of films for Chinese American actors to star in the United States. And so he teamed up with his producing partner and to basically make a movie. They're like, well, what can we make? What can we do for cheap? And first they were going to make a kung fu film, and they're like, no, that's too obvious. So they're like, let's make a horror movie. Horror movie's really popular. They make money. James Hong's like, I'm going to direct it and I'll star in it. So they said like, well, what do we have access to? And the fucking producer was like, well, my friends own a vineyard up in Northern California, and they both got their start in Northern California as like in the theater and acting community up there. So they had friends and stuff who had done acting in small film production in Northern California. But like, I have this vineyard. Well, let's make a movie about that. And so the movie is basically one of the weirdest fucking movies. It's basically James Hong plays this. He owns this vineyard. What the vineyard does though is it takes the essence of young people and gives him longevity. Makes him immortal. But he needs to drink this wine concoction of the life essence of all these people. There's zombies in it. It's one of the fucking craziest. I put it out. I'm trying to think of Vinegar Syndrome. I think it was
Vinegar Syndrome. Yeah.
They put it out, and I'd never even fucking heard of this movie. And I saw the trailer online that Vinegar Syndrome put out, and I was like, I need to fucking own this movie. And weirdly, it's got some of my favorite zombie makeups of all time in it. In fact, there's a sequence that's very reminiscent of, just has a vibe of Michael Jackson's Thriller, which I'm sure might have been a reference. Anyways, the movie's fucking bananas. First of all, it's got James Hong. One of my favorite things is like at the beginning, James Hong is like, he basically has this really sexy girlfriend. And it's like, you see this like really like you basically see James Hong in like a sex scene, and you're like, oh, you think he's just, most of the time in that kind of vanity project, you would think like, oh, James Hong is casting himself as a sexy leading man. No, the whole thing turns out she thinks he's gross. She's only with him because he's rich and stuff. But anyways, the movie has this weird charm throughout the whole thing, and it's like really bizarre, and like it's just a weirdest fucking movie. But I really enjoyed it. The first time I watched it, I was like, I really honestly was like, I did not expect myself to really like this movie as much as I did. I don't know if anybody else will feel the same way outside of the people of Vinegar Syndrome, but I really enjoy the movie.
It is really enjoyable. It's a lot of fun. It's very 1989. Like, it just feels like the period. There's a lot of like what the fuck moments, not just in weirdness, but also in why would a rational person do that? Like, why would you go in that room after you heard that noise? That sort of logic breaking going on. It's just trying to have fun. And I do respect what Hong was doing with it. He did, in the kind of hero role, he did cast an Asian actor, which you can definitely, you can
Asian
see.
Like biracial Asian, but he's definitely an Asian. I was going to say, thank you for bringing that up. I wanted to bring that up.
So I definitely understand why he wanted to make a movie and write and directed it himself and cast himself as the villain and gave the lead to another young Asian American actor. I highly respect the fact that he did it that way, took that route.
Same.
As for the story, there's nothing particularly special about it. It's just fun. It's a good hour and a half, and it's on Tubi.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. But again, the whole premise is bizarre, but it's like halfway through the movie, you're not even. It's just like, you know, these people are being like, I don't know. It's like the premise doesn't even matter. You just go along for the ride and enjoy it for what it is. It's weird little horror movie.
You'll ask yourself, now, is she a zombie or is she a ghost? You know, but but you'll have fun asking. Well, with that all being said, I'm sorry if we skipped anybody's favorite. I know we've skipped some of my favorites. I know we've skipped some of your favorites, but we just have so much to talk about. I think you're right. I think we could do a full year of just weekly episodes of doing a different movie from 1989. No idea this was such a banner year for horror sci-fi when we first dove into this pool. But thanks for diving into this pool with me, James. Always a pleasure.
Same here. I feel like I say this every episode, but every single episode. First off, there's movies now I want to watch. I'm going to watch
Moonstalker.
The other one, Moonstalker. I'm going to watch Moonstalker. But the fact that I didn't know Bruce Campbell did the voiceovers. I always learn things. So this is always a pleasure. I get a kick out of it, even if our audience doesn't enjoy it as much as I do. I don't care. I enjoy it. It's always a pleasure, and I really look forward to the next episode.
Likewise, I love talking to you about this stuff. There's nobody that knows horror more than you do in my life. So it's always fun to put our heads together and see what kind of common memories we can come up with and what kind of recommendations we can make for one another. And hopefully everyone else likes coming along for the ride. If you do like coming along for the ride, then make sure that you subscribe to us. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, anywhere that you want to find us. You can probably find us. We're also on YouTube now. And you can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And we'll make it sometime soon for what are we doing next? Are we doing the action and thrillers of 1989?
I guess now we'll do action thrillers and then follow up with whatever sci-fi films we didn't talk about.
Like I said, I think we mostly got it. I mean, we didn't cover Robot Jocks and a few other things that were purely sci-fi, but I'm not sure I have a whole lot to say about Robot Jocks.
Well, I do. So we'll bring, but it's an action film, so it's definitely
okay. There you go. We'll bring it up and we'll talk about Cyborg then too, which could have qualified as sci-fi.
There's no way I'm not bringing up Cyborg.
So I look forward to it, and there's definitely some big action movies I plan to bring up, not just the obvious sort of Lethal Weapon stuff and Batman stuff from '89. So
you're talking about the Snake Eater films, obviously, the Lorenzo Lamas Snake Eater films, I'm assuming.
Clearly. What else is there to talk about? We'll do that very soon. I promise we won't go as long this time. We just had to do a lot of research on this one because there was so much. I literally put this off an extra week at one point just because I needed to watch more movies.
Yeah, and same here. And even now I feel like there's a few that we didn't talk about, but that I haven't seen that I'm going to have to watch immediately because, it was literally a banner year for horror.
Absolutely. All right, everybody. So we will talk to you soon. Until then, make sure that you're safe. And James, any final words?
No, just, say it again. Happy 2021. Things are hopefully looking better, but remember to wear your masks, socially distance. And as always, thanks for listening.
Yeah, what he said.